Hello, everyone. This is Saida, and on behalf of Pure Storage, Amazon, and 451 Research, which is now a part of S&P Global Market Intelligence, I would like to welcome you and say thank you for attending today's roundtable titled Architecting a Cloud-Native Approach to Data Protection and Disaster Recovery. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it on the question box on your screen. We will get to as many as we can during the Q&A session. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section in the console. And finally, the on-demand version of this roundtable will be available shortly after the live event concludes. We welcome our speakers today, and with that, I'll pass it to Henry.
Thanks much, Ida, and thank you all for joining us today. For today's topic, we're going to be going over what's going on in terms of changes in perspective and the changes in strategy for how to deal with cloud-native type workloads. I'm Henry Baltzar. I'm the Research Director of Storage at 451 S&P Global. I'm responsible for covering storage systems, software, and also cloud storage type elements, and based in San Francisco. Let's go on to John.
Hi, John Owings. I am the Director for Cloud Native Strategy at Pure Storage. Work with the Portworx business unit and all of our strategy around how data works with them. And I'm actually based in Atlanta, Georgia.
And Jeremy?
Great. Thanks, Henry. My name is Jeremy Cowan, and I manage the developer advocacy team for EKS at Amazon Web Services. Thanks for having me.
Oh, great. Thanks all for joining us. And let's get to the first point here. In terms of our agenda, it's pretty simple. With three basic areas we're going to cover. First area we're going to talk about is data protection challenges and what I've been hearing in our surveys and in our phone interviews with end users. After that, we'll be talking a little bit about cloud native data protection and the preferences and how that market's evolving, which will be great insight from both the Portworx side and also from the AWS side as well. And finally, the last section we're going to be diving into another topic that's quite unavoidable these days is ransomware, and how the threat of ransomware and all these other things are really triggering the need to do more data improvements and get a little bit more best practices from both of our panelists today. Starting out with the first area in terms of data protection challenges, some of the main things I definitely want to highlight when we talk about this and why this is so important is, first of all, outages are quite common. In our most recent surveys, over 30% of our respondents had a significant outage sometime in the last 2 years, which wound up causing them to either lose data or lose a significant amount of worker productivity. The other thing that we're noticing is that for many of these outages, they can be quite expensive. 30% of respondents said that their last outage cost them over $1 million, which is clearly something we have to be wary of. I think the other element here that we have to think about in terms of how we're going to evolve our data protection and how we're going to do a better job with recovery is the fact that outages themselves are not that simple. If we look at the cause of outages, we have 34% saying that they were most recent outages caused by network failure. 28% who are saying that it was a public cloud or SaaS service failure that led to their outage, and another 25% saying it was a hardware failure. But honestly, we need to dive deeper into these things, because what I found going into more of the phone interviews and diving into them in terms of, you said it was network failure, but was it really network failure? In some cases, things that are network failures actually wind up potentially being things like human error, where the network admin accidentally fat-fingered typed the wrong thing and wind up bringing down the network or creating other types of issues. So I think as we dive into this, it's clear that data protection is not just about the backup application. It's about all the other elements that we have to start thinking about in the ecosystem in terms of how we're going to use the observability to track what's going on and get a better idea of what's causing these outages and how to prevent them in the future. And also, I think the other issue here is that the last point on the bottom here, which in the survey, 74% of respondents said it took a moderate to significant amount of effort to complete their recovery, which to me shows that there's definitely need for us to figure out better ways of doing this. I think better ways of using automation. I think other things, that's another gap is, we could definitely do a better job of doing testing and other elements like that as well. And with that, we'll start with the first question, and I'll kick this off with John. John, on your side, obviously comprehensive data protection across VMs, and, Kubernetes, all these other different types of elements, and also being able to do this in multiple geographies, because again, one of the major benefits of using Kubernetes is it can be in multiple places. It can be on premises, it can be in the edge, it can be in the cloud. can be created in lots of different service formats. Can you talk a little bit about what Portworx is doing to help customers deal with this data protection challenge?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, Portworx was built to, provide data services for, cloud native. So at the beginning, that was containers, and it's really morphed into Kubernetes because that's probably what, 99% of the people are going to ask about. What it really provides is the ability to mobilize that data. And with that, right, you get DR solutions. So you get, hey, I can now fail over from one cluster to another, that whole application from an application-centric view, right? So it's not just like, hey, give me the LUNs or move them over, or the block devices and copy them somewhere else. It's, take, Postgres SQL and have it fail over, right? So it's more of an application-centric approach, which fits into the Kubernetes mindset, right? So that lets you kind of do it in lots of different, depending on your own requirements, right? We could do it like asynchronously or synchronously or near synchronously, those types of things. So it's kind of how Portworx, or all three, if you need to do that, right? So depending on the SLA for the app. So that's what how Portworx approaches the disaster recovery and testing it as well. Obviously, testing it makes it a lot easier to see when it does fail over.
I'm just curious. I mean, since you're providing these services and capabilities to the broader Kubernetes customers, are you seeing that diversity in terms of where they want to have the workloads potentially, and the need to be able to make sure that data protection can reach wherever those workloads wind up running?
I would say there's a chunk that want to do like a on-premises to the cloud, or at least be able to have the option to go to both. Where I see most of the questions come from is like, I want EKS in AWS, but I want to run in multiple AZs or multiple regions of AWS, right? So now I'm able to kind of provide a little bit of extension of what EKS is able to do by, replicating workloads to other regions and those types of things. But that's probably the most common question, is like, how can I move from one part of AWS to the other?
Yeah. Okay. That's great stuff. Let's go to Jeremy. Jeremy, from your perspective, just on a high level, are you seeing, for the cloud native type customers you deal with on a daily basis, are you seeing their expectations for rapid recovery and data protections rising? And what are you seeing in terms of those customers and what they're trying to do to be able to keep up?
Yeah. So I would say that our customers want to be able to recover quickly if or when an issue occurs. And with Kubernetes, recovery of applications is a little different. For example, when you create a deployment, Kubernetes will automatically attempt to restart your pods. And at first, it will try restarting pods on the nodes that they're originally running on. If that node is unhealthy or is under pressure, the scheduler is going to look at alternatives. For example, they'll try to schedule your pod onto another node within the cluster. However, I think your question is really about disaster recovery. And today, the EKS service team frequently backs up at CD and has the ability to restore clusters from that backup when absolutely necessary. Now, this is not a regular occurrence. We don't ordinarily recover clusters on behalf of customers. So it's important when you use a service like EKS that you understand the shared responsibility model and recognize what is your responsibility, including things like backup. And there are lots of good options available for backing up Kubernetes. Portworx has an excellent solution. And there are very good open source solutions in the market too, if that's your preference.
And John, sorry, guys. Go ahead.
I was going to say now, for stateful applications, recovery of those applications may be a little different. Kubernetes will still attempt to restart the pods, but it becomes a little complicated if you need to recover that application in a different cluster or in a different availability zone, especially if you're using EBS volumes or Elastic Block Store volumes, which are zonal. That is, they can only be accessed from the zone that they were created in.
Okay. John, do you have anything to add on that in terms of those capabilities and requirements?
No, I mean that's absolutely what we're seeing is you have to kind of treat the stateful apps a little bit different, right? Because put it this way, is like Kubernetes really isn't built to replicate those to another Kubernetes. Like it's not there. That's kind of why Portworx exists. Like, hey, we want to add this layer that wasn't originally there, and so yes, like backup. Obviously, we can take that and put it into some, kind of a frozen state of storage, and also have a, quick failover. So depending on, hey, if you're replicating and you corrupt the data, you're going to want to have to go to like a known good state. So that's why we also have backup.
Okay, great stuff. One of the points I made towards the end was in terms of how many people say that it's very difficult to complete a recovery operation. And to me, that just lends itself in terms of we need to do a better job of testing, a better job of automation. Can you talk a little bit about what Portworx does, John, on your side, in terms of to be able to simplify the testing aspects and other elements of this?
Absolutely. So it really kind of comes down to, the same Kubernetes tooling, right? So if I can have a deployment on a DR side that is kind of scaled down. So right, the way that Portworx does it is we can have a live version in cluster 1 and it has its data. We're replicating the data asynchronously or synchronously, depending on, where you're going. And that deployment, what's cool is like, it'll actually copy that deployment and it'll keep it scaled to 0. So really the test or the failover or whatever is comes down to how fast can you say replica equals 1 or 3 or whatever it's supposed to be, right? So that's pretty nice. Now, obviously, we have customers that even automate that portion, so I like to have the red button. I don't want it to like automatically fail over, but maybe you do have an app that does that. So I like to make sure it's down and hit, like I like to have the big red panic button that will flip everything. But it's all there and prepared. That's what's kind of cool about what Portworx does is it's ready to go. If you need to hit that button or even to test it, like obviously like what you're getting at is practice. Make sure it comes up. So like when you do it, you bring it up, you make sure that it's the database is not in some bad state where it won't mount. There's all kinds of things that can happen. So we let you do that.
Yeah, and Henry, I'll also add that a lot of our customers are interested in using AWS backup to back up EKS clusters. And we're looking at potentially adding that as an option later this year. And that will give customers the ability to restore their clusters, which will be particularly handy if they're apprehensive about upgrading their cluster, because with EKS, we do in-place cluster upgrades. And as part of our best practices, we recommend backing up your cluster before you do an upgrade to a new minor version of Kubernetes. And this will definitely help customers do that and put them at ease, knowing that they'll have the ability to recover their cluster if the if the upgrade goes south.
Okay. And to add to that too, one last point, because you reminded me of it, is we do have customers that do that now with Portworx because we can back up those stateful apps or do the migrate feature, which is kind of the same as DR, is like, hey, bring up, you have a 1.22 cluster, the latest is 1.24, bring that up, make sure you like it, and then you start moving apps, and that way you could always go back if something doesn't go right? So, to kind of add on to what Jeremy was just saying.
Okay. Great stuff. Let's move on and dive a little bit deeper into the cloud native parts of this. So looking at the cloud native data protection preferences, and the survey we ran last year, what we're seeing and continues a trend that we saw over the last 3 years in the past, I mean, just 3 years ago, we saw a lot of the organizations saying, we're just going to go with our legacy existing data protection tools. And that's flipped over the last couple of years with now we got 58% of respondents saying that they would prefer to have a backup or DR tool that has been optimized for container platforms and orchestration, as opposed to just going with what they're already using, maybe for their physical backups or their virtualization backups and whatnot. So, that's a gradual change. And I think that really highlights why this is a different problem and why this is probably a key area where you might want to do innovation and not just go with the standard backup type of platforms. Yeah, and that's a little bit contrary to where we've been going in the industry, because I think over the last decade or so, a lot of complaints we've heard from organizations are, we don't want no tool, we don't want blah, blah, blah. There's too many tools, we don't want to do this. But at the end of the day, you need to have a tool that can do the problem, that could actually handle the workload the right way. And by that, it's not just backing up the data, as we've been talking about, the nuances that we're talking about here. There's a lot of other elements we have to protect, like etcd and all the other metadata and all the other orchestration and other capabilities there. That's not just the data. So again, I think those are why some of these reasons why we need to start thinking about why potentially it'd be good to use a third party or some other type of tool for this. I think the other thing to note here is we still do have like 9% of organizations that think that they're just going to do snapshots. And this is a topic we'll be diving into a little bit later, but there is that very much a do-it-yourself mentality with cloud native, but we'll talk about that shortly. I don't want to spoil too much of that, but again, as we see this evolving, it's clear that we're starting to see more organizations realize that cloud native is a different kind of beast, and they may want to find something that's been architected for that to really meet their requirements there.
Yeah, absolutely, Henry. Sorry for interrupting here. I look at this as being very akin to what happened with the security industry a few years ago. As cloud native became an increasingly popular way to build and run applications, customers wanted to use their existing tooling to secure their environments, but quickly recognized that they weren't really designed to account for the differences between containers and virtual machines. And you saw a lot of new vendors enter this space, and I think we're seeing that now with storage.
Yeah, I'm definitely highlighting on that point. You're right. I mean, that's the security point. If I look at it from the backup point, it wasn't that long ago where we had physical backup was leading it, and they tried doing bolt-ons to handle the VMs, and look what happened. Now there's a handful of multi-billion-dollar companies that are doing virtualization backup. So the change in platform is significant. It's not just, we went from VMs to containers. A lot of these things can be very significant and different enough to where you need to take a new approach and look at new technologies to be able to do these things. So it's definitely a great point to highlight. I think the other thing we looked at also is where people want to store their cloud-native backup storage. And what was interesting was we saw that it was a wide variety of different areas. We did have 37% respondents, the most respondents saying that they were going to do an on-premise and cloud storage hybrid type model where they're storing data in both places. 33% that were thinking, we're going to store it exclusively in public cloud storage, and another 27% saying that they were going to do their backup storage completely on premises. So when I look at this, it's clear that there's probably going to be multiple locations, and it's probably going to be diverse for a while. So it's going to be important for whatever platform you use to be able to handle all these different things. And also, since some of these things are hybrid, that in effect is going to entail efficient data movement or migration across these different silos if it's on-premise to cloud, especially if you're changing your recovery point from maybe it's an on-premise application failing over to a cloud or vice versa. That's where it's going to be really important to be able to handle the data the proper way and also all the orchestration elements. From this, let's go into the first question. And a question for you, Jeremy. What are some of the key aspects that AWS customers should be looking at for their cloud-native environments?
Insofar as where they store their backups?
Not just the storage backups, but in general, like if they're shopping for a tool, what are the must-haves you think they should have to be able to do?
Well, so they really want a tool that is container aware, that could back up volumes that are attached to those containers. For Kubernetes, that would be like a stateful set, for instance. Ideally, you want the tool to be able to be not only like cloud native aware, but also application aware, especially for highly transactional applications. You want the tool to be able to quiesce or pause the application so that it can get a consistent snapshot or backup of the data. And you also want a tool that gives you the greatest flexibility in where you can restore that backup if you have to. Be it the same cluster or a different cluster, or the same cluster in a different availability zone. You want to have as much flexibility as you can as to where you restore your backup.
Yeah, that's all great stuff. Let's work backwards from that. John, from your perspective, a lot of what he talked about in the end was that mobility and where you want to recover. And likewise, mobility is a great capability for us to be able to move and change execution venues when needed. Can you talk a little bit about what Portworx does to help facilitate these data and workload migrations?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a multi-pronged approach, right? Like from a backup, like that enables migration in a way, right? Like if I put everything in an object store like S3, that's available to me wherever I go. Like I can restore to a new place. So that's one way. But also with Portworx, I can actually just do migrates, almost not quite a live migration or vMotion, right? But I can take a workload, I can mark it as migrating and schedule it and say, hey, once you finish copying the data, flip the live copy. So it'll basically automate the scale down and scale up into the new cluster. And we have customers doing that now to migrate into the cloud, right? So I think later we'll talk about a couple of customer examples. There's one that we'll mention that did that to be able to get their workloads up into AWS. So it's a great thing to do, but it could be for DR purposes, or I'm moving clouds, whichever one it is. That mobility is extremely important, and making it easy to do is the key, right? Making it as easy as, hey, I have an app here, a stateful set here, I have a stateful set here, scale one down, one up, and everything's live. That's the end goal.
Yeah, I think Jeremy made a really interesting point as well at the start of his part as well, in terms of talking about the need for application awareness and going up the stack and doing that integration. Can you talk a little bit about what Portworx has been doing to do that? Because as you said, it's about making things easier. Yeah. And one way is to integrate with the app. So can you talk about the value proposition and what you guys are working on?
Yeah, there's a couple things there around, obviously there's ways that we kind of do that synchronously or asynchronously. The main thing is being aware of the application, knowing that this stateful set has, 5 replicas and AKA five volumes, right? If you're going to snapshot that to copy it somewhere, you need to group them, right? And because we control that whole data management layer, we're able to do that. We can say, hey, if you asked me to back up this or migrate or DR this particular application, and it has 5, 10, 15 volumes all attached to it, being aware of that relationship is what Portworx does, right? One of the things, but that's what we do for that is we take all that atomically, basically snapshot it together, and then copy the data, or, take a point in time and copy it. Those types of things are key to that app functioning on its destination. And that's one of the key things that we do.
Yeah, I'd say another thing that customers often inquire about is how to do blue-green cluster upgrades, or how to migrate from, say, their on-premises environment to EKS. And I see Portworx being able to fill the void here by making that a lot simpler for customers. Blue-green cluster upgrades are complex. GitOps will get you part of the way there, especially for stateless applications. But when you're dealing with applications that are storing data on EBS volumes, then you need a mechanism to migrate that data to the new cluster with the least amount of interruption possible.
Okay, great. Actually, we did get a question from the audience that kind of matches what we're talking about here. So with Portworx, how do you keep data synchronized between two data center stores or compute platforms? Is that built into the Portworx platform?
Yes, absolutely. So you basically create a relationship between the two clusters and copy the data. We copy the data between them. So you set the rules like, hey, I want this copied every 15 minutes, or I want it synchronously copied. And there's some guardrails we put around synchronous, right? It's 10 millisecond latency, those kind of things. But from one AZ and AWS to another, that's a no-brainer. That you could do that fairly easily. But if you're doing like on-prem to the cloud, it all depends on kind of networking and those types of things. But yes, we handle that depending on your requirements.
Okay, great. Moving to the next part of this topic here, I think one of the questions I hinted at earlier was, again, when we talk about cloud native, a big difference is the people. And the people in cloud native are wired a bit differently than people the previous generation that were doing more core infrastructure type components and used to buying things off the shelf. A lot of cloud native people are used to creating and building their own and using their own skills and work sets here. Are you seeing, let's start with Jeremy, since you're in the trenches with the Kubernetes people, are you seeing perspective changing there in terms of why they should go third party as opposed to just building it themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a camp that wants to do things themselves or use an open source solution, but a lot of the larger enterprises don't want to deal with that. They'd rather buy instead of build. That way they don't have to worry about the maintenance of the tool or solution that they build. They're essentially outsourcing that to a vendor, and they're not responsible for the evolution of that particular solution. Again, they rely on the vendor for that. That's not to say that there aren't folks who are building their own solutions. There are lots of stateful applications that come with operators that include the ability to back up the application, the stateful application that the operator is for. Usually operators perform lifecycle operations on the application. But having an option like Portworx is really nice, especially for large enterprises, because it's another thing that they don't have to deal with themselves.
Okay, well, let's turn this to John. I'm just kind of curious from that perspective. When you're talking to customers, obviously there's two motivations there. One motivation being, well, what happens if we lose that rockstar DevOps or SRE? Who's going to maintain this thing and build it out or keep it running as the applications change? And then the other part is, time to value. Like, what could we be doing if we're not managing this thing? When you're talking to your customers, which of these influences do you see more of?
Yeah, so I actually have a customer here in Atlanta that just went through that. They had someone super smart build this really cool storage system, and he left. And now they're stuck, like going, how do we? If this goes down, like we don't know what to do. So they're obviously looking at Portworx as an alternative to that, because if someone leaves, they could always still call me, or Portworx, and get an answer. So that's absolutely a true thing. But what I'm seeing from big enterprise banks to telcos is they want something. Yes, like you're saying, they want something deployed fast. And they want something that they know they can call and get help, right? Or get on Slack and get help, right? So it's the getting that portion off their plate. And I mean, that's what, obviously, like, I'm biased. I feel like maybe the people that want that come to me more because that's what we have and that's what we do. But I do run into customers that are like, hey, I want to do everything myself. And some of them go and they find out that they really don't, so sometimes it's just takes them a few months to learn. And that's actually another avenue that I've seen happen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really need to ask yourself whether designing a backup solution is really adding value to your company. Mm-hmm. I would say the majority of folks say that it does not.
Yeah, they have. I would say they have better things they can contribute to their the value of their company.
Yeah, great stuff. I guess I can't leave this topic without the other topic that's probably the elephant in the room. Everybody's concerned about cost, especially controlling cost and whatnot. Let's start with Jeremy on this one. Can you talk a little bit about how customers and how Amazon, what you guys are providing to potentially help customers rein in cost and make sure things don't spiral out of control?
Yeah. So we actually have a lot of different ways that customers could potentially lower their spend. The first is spot. This is excess capacity that we have that you can use for compute. The primary difference between it and, say, on demand is that it's interruptible, or it can be preempted. You're given a 2-minute warning before the machine is terminated, but you do get to use that compute for as much as 70 or 80% less than the on-demand cost for that instance. We also have compute savings plans, which you can think of as like a discount that you could purchase for different compute services within AWS. There's also, an EDP, which entitles you to like a blanket discount across all AWS services. As for like Kubernetes specifically, we have Carpenter, which is a cluster autoscaler, which attempts to align the capacity with the demands or the requirements of the pods that you're trying to run within your cluster. And it will also consolidate pods onto fewer instances over time. So I think consolidation, if I'm not mistaken, occurs once every 10 seconds, where the controller will look at the capacity that's being used to run the pods within the cluster. And if there's an opportunity to consolidate those pods onto fewer instances or to replace an instance within your cluster with a lower cost instance, it will do that. And we're seeing customers save as much as 60 to 70% by making use of Carpenter. Graviton is yet another way that they could use or lower their compute spend. Graviton is a lower cost yet high performing processor that we have available for compute. And so we're seeing a lot of customers take advantage of that. The only caveat there is that you may need to build multi-architecture images so that your applications can run on both ARM and AMD 64 processors.
Oh, great stuff. Before we leave that topic, John, on your side, I mean, Portworx does a number of things also in the backups and storage capabilities. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing for cost optimization?
Yeah. Well, one cool thing, because Jeremy mentioned it, the EDP is the way Portworx is partnered with AWS is we can go under that. So whatever discounts you're getting from AWS, we could fall into that and help you use your contract. So that's one way. The second one is, the technical thing that we do to help you save is called Autopilot. I know there's other products out there called Autopilot, but I'm going to claim we called ours that first. But what it does is actually monitors your storage usage, the pool that you create from Portworx. So it actually watches what you're using, either from a single application or an entire pool, and will expand it when you need to. So think of it as cluster auto scaling, but for storage for data. So I don't have to guess, well, maybe at the end of the year, I need 500 terabytes of storage, and I deploy all that, and then maybe use, if I only use 100 terabytes, I'm still paying, 5x, right? So this allows you to scale as you go. And we have customers that have done that and actually, help drive consolidation, which is important. You use the resources that you fully use the resources that you're paying for. That way you're not kind of, paying for things that are kind of that are just reserved and going to waste.
And I would say from a storage perspective, AWS has lots of different types of storage, block storage with EBS, and even within block storage, we have different classes like IO2 and GP3 and all that with different performance characteristics. There's also S3, our object store, EFS, our file storage, FSX for Lustre. There are a variety of different types of storage, which I believe Portworx can make use of, that also present additional opportunities for customers to save.
Yeah, there's no reason to put a low priority application on the most expensive NVMe storage that AWS has, and we can help. For sure. We can help you with that automatically, like basically automate that portion.
Yeah, that's all great stuff, and yeah, clearly it's going to continue to be a big concern for customers. Because I mean, it's great to have an automated, very dynamic type environment, but again, you can't let the cost go out of control either. So it's always going to be important to have these controls and optimizations in place. So getting into the last topic we'll be talking about is ransomware and how this is driving the need for data protection improvements. In the survey, what we found was 59% of our respondents they said they're increasing their spending on both backup services and storage as a result of the potential threat of ransomware. Right now, about 78% of them claim that they're maintaining a gold copy of data for recovery in ransomware incidents. Unfortunately, when I dive a little bit deeper into the calls and ask them about this, not all the time. Sometimes the gold copies aren't immutable, which to me is kind of scary. So yeah, I think there's definitely room for improvement in these areas, even though many organizations claim they have something to recover off of. Some organizations are also looking at recovery guarantees and insurance and other elements like that. So those are other things we have to think about going forward. But to me, some of the main things we have to think about from the ransomware side is right now, only about 25% of the respondents said they were extremely confident in their ability to recover data from ransomware incidents. And when we look at where these copies of data are stored, it's highly diverse. You've got 61% saying they want to do the gold copies on premises, 47% in public cloud, and then another 27% looking to do this. I can't believe it, still on tape. Tape's not going away. 27% still on tape, and we actually ran into organizations just in the last my last Q4 calls where they got rid of tape and it's coming back again after 8 years. Yeah, so it's hard to roll out tape, but there are definitely negatives to going to a tape, and in terms of how long it takes to recover and other elements like that. And diving a little bit deeper into one of the calls we had with a financial services organization, even this organization, which is relatively large and it's not like they don't have resources, up to like $5 billion in revenue. But when you look at them, even they realize that they don't have immutable copies for everything yet. They're trying to figure out the best way of doing this and the best way they can improve their recovery capabilities. And just to be clear, the reason why I keep harping on the immutable stuff is this day and age with ransomware, the safety net, which is the backups and the repositories, that's what's under attack these days. Because if you can take out the backups, then you're forcing the people that have been attacked by this to have to consider paying the ransom or any other negative things that go about with a successful attack. So to me, there's going to be a lot of different areas here where we have to do improvement. And because of this threat, you can't just say, oh, I have backup. It's not enough to just have backup. We have to make sure we're doing the right kinds of security and other elements like that. And for this round, let's start with John first. And just curious, I mean, now that obviously ransomware is a security issue and the backup side's on the storage and infrastructure side, I'm just curious, from what you see today, are you getting into more conversations with CISOs and other security professionals in terms of what Portworx can add in value?
Yeah. So we've always we've talked to them a lot in the past because they're, with container images going in and out. They're always concerned about things coming from the internet or where, what your software supply chain is. We have all of our, certifications and, white papers for customers to do that. It's absolutely a thing that we've been talking about for a long time. But what started coming up over, like you said, over the last year or so is how do you lock that backup, right? So we have added features to do that, like an object lock support. So if you're writing to an S3 compatible store or you're writing to S3, you can actually check the box, say lock this, and that way, even if that key that I used to write it can't change it. So someone compromises my system, they can't go in and encrypt that backup and cause problems for you, right? So that's absolutely something that is of definite interest to those security teams and the CISOs, that having that. Absolutely. It's not detecting it or anything like that, but it's actually, if the worst happens and you don't detect it, we at least have a copy that they weren't able to change. So that's what we're able to do for them.
Great. And Jeremy, from your perspective, from the Amazon side, what are some of the things you highlight in terms of capabilities? I think during our pre-call, we talked about things like guarded, there are elements like that. Can you talk a little bit about some of the capabilities that you advocate to your customers, what they could use to help handle ransomware?
Yeah. So the first thing that they really ought to do is minimize the risk from ransomware. And they could accomplish this by practicing defense in depth, which really involves implementing controls at different layers of the stack. And I'll be the first to admit here that securing a Kubernetes environment is a non-trivial exercise for a lot of organizations. There are a multitude of ways that you can harden your environment. And they include things like creating minimal images, preventing containers from running as root or as privileged, running containers with a read-only root file system, preventing containers from mounting directories from the host, scanning images for vulnerabilities, only running images from trusted repositories. And if customers are interested in learning about protecting their environment from ransomware and other types of attacks, I recommend they visit the EKS Best Practices Guide. I could post a link into the chat here later for that site, or you can search Google for EKS Best Practices, and I'm sure you'll find it. As for AWS capabilities around ransomware or detecting ransomware, we have Amazon GuardDuty, which you alluded to, Henry, which is a service that analyzes the Kubernetes audit log for suspicious behaviors like privileged escalation or anonymous access. These are things that could give you an early warning signal that your environment is being probed. And at reInvent this year, GuardDuty announced that they're going to be launching a service that will add runtime security to a Kubernetes environment, giving folks greater insight into what's happening within their clusters. And aside from implementing those controls and identifying and protecting against threats, customers should absolutely have an incident response plan that includes instructions for who to contact when an incident occurs, how to find and eliminate the threat, and how to recover from the incident. You don't really want to wait until an incident occurs to create or exercise your plan for the first time. So I'd encourage all of the folks who are listening to this webinar to regularly practice their incident response plan. A lot of applications that run on Kubernetes are stateless, or they store state outside of Kubernetes, especially if they're following the 12-factor app pattern. They'll store state in a database service like DynamoDB or RDS. And recovering a stateless application should be relatively straightforward. especially if the configuration is stored in a Git repository that's unaffected by the ransomware. You basically reapply that configuration to your cluster or a new cluster if that's necessary. For stateful applications, you probably want to look at using an operator, as I talked about before, or a partner solution like Portworx to back up the application. The EBS CSI driver includes the ability to create snapshots of EBS volumes, but that has its limitations. The restore from a snapshot is manual effort. You could automate it, but it's a little complicated. And so again, this is where I think Portworx adds a lot of value. And then of course, we have lots of different storage services like DynamoDB that offer things like point-in-time recovery. You can store your backups in S3 and use object lock, as John was saying. AWS backup, if you're using AWS backup to back up your worker nodes or other elements of your infrastructure, has a feature called Vault Lock, which is basically worm storage for your backups. And there's nothing specific that we have today for Kubernetes around ransomware, except a lot of preventative controls, preventative and detective controls that we have.
Yeah, and I think all of those are valuable because, again, we have to figure out what causes these issues and how to trace back and do the postmortems and whatnot. So, and also how to avoid these things in the future. So, a lot of these capabilities are very, very important. John, for your side, I mean, I look at my notes. The PX Backup 2.2 release you guys had late last year, you had a number of anti-ransomware type capabilities. Can you talk a little bit about the enhancements?
Yeah, so obviously the object lock was the big one, like being able to support a write once kind of copy. That was big, and then add on top of that like the RBAC controls. This really kind of sets PX Backup apart. Is I could tie to your own OIDC or whatever, and I can make sure that John, I have my backups. I only see and restore my backups, and Jeremy can only see his backups, and I can't go mess with his data, right? So that if some reason I get in trouble and someone's using my credentials, the scope is limited, right? So there's some really cool RBAC that's built into that to allow for security, like in access and auditing and seeing who accesses what, but also self-service. So now the developers, if they're backing things up, they can restore it themselves rather than waiting for a ticket to go to the backup team and that for them to go to Iron Mountain and get the tape and bring it back and or whatever, right? So there's some cool things you can do around that.
Okay, great stuff. So with that, I would like to encourage the rest of the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to send them out there. We'll definitely try to get through as many of these as we can. Ida, do you have a couple of the questions queued up?
Oh, yes, Henry, thank you. Just like you said, as a reminder, if you have a question, please type it in the question box. We have the first question from the audience. Here it goes. How will Portworx and Amazon make it easier to run databases in cloud-native worlds?
So I'll start on that one. Is we actually just in the last year released a product called Portworx Data Services. It's our PDS for short. You may hear me ramble when I start to talk. I'll call it PDS because it's less of a mouthful. But what it is a database platform as a service, really to take those stateful applications that our customers have run over the last 5-6 years in Kubernetes and wrap a self-service platform around them that's still, it's still built on Kubernetes. It can, you can target EKS. I can target on-premises clusters anywhere, right? Or EKS anywhere is what I meant to say, and use those stateful apps in a curated way, right? Like, so now I don't have to become an expert in each and every one of them. So there's There's 7 services in there now: Postgres, Cassandra, MySQL, Redis, Kafka, a few others. But and then there'll be probably, by the time anyone watches this recording, there'll be several more. So you always keep checking to see if there's something that's not on your list. It may be on there soon. But it's really built with kind of that knowledge that we gained over supporting customers over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah, and from the AWS standpoint, we recently released integration with Marketplace. So vendors who have applications, stateful applications that run on Kubernetes can offer those solutions through Marketplace, and customers can deploy those solutions directly to their cluster from within the EKS console. So we have a relatively small catalog of third-party services available today, but we anticipate that growing very rapidly over the next few months. So that will give customers a very easy way to deploy stateful applications onto Kubernetes.
Okay, next question. What are the current challenges with running stateful applications on Amazon AKS?
EKS.
Yeah, EKS. Yeah. So I'd say the biggest challenge that customers have today is probably with EBS. EBS is a zonal service, as I had mentioned before. It can only be accessed from within the zone where it resides. And that presents challenges if the pod for that application is rescheduled in a different availability zone. We are considering allowing customers to create replicas of EBS volumes in other availability zones and synchronizing the changes to those volumes. But until then, customers have to confine their stateful applications to an availability zone if they are using EBS. Customers would prefer not to do that because they want flexibility as to where they run those workloads. There could be a disruption in a particular availability zone that forces them to move that workload to a different availability zone to maintain availability. This is where Portworx really adds a lot of value, especially when running stateful applications.
Yes, I don't have anything to add to that. That's what it's kind of the problem we solve, obviously, in either local or between zones or between regions even. So.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you talk through a real-world example of a customer using Portworx and AWS to address data protection and disaster recovery?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. We actually have a case study, and we may have it in the folder for people to download. If not, we can send the link out. But there's CHG Healthcare, the healthcare company. They actually used Portworx. They wanted to move to the cloud. They wanted kind of to stop buying internal infrastructure. But to get there, they needed to have a DR solution for these applications they're developing in Kubernetes. So obviously it was a perfect fit. Like, they use Portworx with EKS, and now they have DR, and it's saved them time. Like, they're able to iterate, like the DevOps mantra is, right, where I can actually do quick and fast updates to my applications and have new innovation as we go. But also they're saving on licensing for some of the software that they run to process streaming data for their application that they also ran in Kubernetes on-prem. So there's a few things that we did for them that really help them. But one of the main drivers, like the first requirement, was you can't go until you have a way to do like a cluster failover. And that's a key thing that we did for them.
Okay, thank you, John. And I believe this will be our last question for today. Can you talk about the different types of DR profiles that can be leveraged to different types of workloads on Amazon EKS?
Yeah, Henry and John, I think you might have to help me a little here. Can you define what a DR profile is in this context?
I'm thinking what we're talking about is maybe the SLAs that would go along with those different types of workloads. So, you know, if I was answering, I would say like, hey, we have an asynchronous version, right? Every 15 minutes it makes a copy. So like you would have like an RPO of 15 minutes or in an RTO of how fast you can fail over.
Yeah.
And then we have a near sync, which is like an optimistic commit, like it's as near to synchronous as you can get. And that is like, hey, I may lose like 30 seconds of data. And then synchronous is zero RPO. Like I don't lose anything at all. Right. So that's how I would answer that. I don't know, like from an AWS standpoint, what would you think?
We don't, so like with the EBS CSI driver, as I said, we have the ability to create snapshots of the volumes that are attached to worker nodes or mounted inside of containers. But customers control how often the snapshots occur. So their RTO or RPO rather would largely depend on how that is configured. I don't have enough information about AWS backup to know whether that's going to offer like continuous backup or whether it'll be a point-in-time backup. But I suspect that over the next few months, additional information will become available about that service.
Yeah, and I'll chime in here. I mean, I think the reason why this is so important is because, as we talked about in the previous section on cost control, I mean, it'd be great if everybody had like gold level data protection support, but most of us don't have unlimited budgets. So you're going to have, as John alluded to, you're going to have multiple trade-offs or different levels in terms of what's the right RPO, RTO. Does it have to be synchronous? Can it be asynchronous? How much of a gap can we have? What kind of performance will we have after recovery? So I think a lot of those things are going to be very important in terms of how we deal with the cost control and making sure these things are manageable. And the other thing, thinking about this from a cloud native perspective, is once you have these policies in place, then it becomes a lot easier when you start deploying more and more workloads. Now you can attach them to a policy instead of writing from scratch every single time. So there's a lot of key benefits here, and yeah, I think that's why it's important for us to be able to have the flexibility and different policies and to make sure that the workload that we're protecting gets the adequate or the right level without going crazy on cost.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. Thank you, Henry, John, and Jeremy. This concludes our roundtable for today. As a reminder, the on-demand version of this event will be available shortly. On behalf of Pure Storage, Amazon, and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.